Hello, everyone, and either welcome or welcome back to the Gender Libertarian Podcast. If you do like this, please rate, comment, and subscribe. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, and on my Patreon page where you do get early access. Link will be down in the show notes. So today I'm talking to Stephanie Slade. She is the managing editor over at Reason Magazine, and she is also the author of the April 2020 cover piece for Reason, Against the New Nationalism, which is talking about this new kind of right-wing nationalist movement thingamajig that is coming up, and also referencing specifically Rich Lowry's book, The Case for Nationalism, which that's kind of where I want to start because that's where the piece starts. And this is a kind of a topic I've been covering for some time now. I did an episode specifically on Against the Dead Consensus, which was an interesting little piece there, which basically my summation of that is, well, screw you too, guys. But even before that, even the Tucker Carlson monologue from last January, that kind of kicked off this whole movement, I guess, for lack of a better word, because I'm still a little confused about exactly what it is these people want. But like I said, I want to start with Lowry's book because it seems like when he is using the word nationalism, he's creating this new definition for it that I think is a bit self-serving and a bit disingenuous. So go ahead and kind of explain how Lowry is like defining down nationalism.
He basically, in the book, he's trying to fight back against the idea that nationalism should be a dirty word. And so he begins by sort of saying, by offering this definition where he basically says, well, nationalism is just basically another word for patriotism. It means you love your country, you're proud of your country, you feel a sense of loyalty to your homeland, and that's all it is. And who could be against that? I think this fails for a couple of reasons. One is that when you start poking and prodding him on what that means, or when you read further into the book or listen to him speak, as he's been promoting the book, you come to find out pretty quickly that actually, this is sort of a cover for something a lot deeper than that. He's sort of trying to smuggle in support for a certain sort of policy orientation into under the cover of that word, and this word that he wants you to believe is just a synonym for love of country. And even more importantly than that, whether or not Rich Lowry intends this, what he seems to be willfully refusing to acknowledge is that there is a whole sort of movement of conservative nationalists. They threw an entire major conference last summer here in Washington, D.C., the National Conservatism Conference, that attended by hundreds of people, including some very big name right of center academics and journalists and a U.S. senator. And they have a quite clear and profoundly illiberal policy agenda that involves massive wealth redistribution, support for American industry, protectionism, exclusionary immigration policies, a much bigger, more meddlesome federal government that tries to sort of reorient the country back to its Judeo-Christian roots and reestablish a sort of the morality that these folks are in favor of. I mean, what they're talking about is an agenda that certainly, by no definition, could be defined down to just like love of country.
Yeah, and I think that's really one of my first problems with this is, I mean, patriotism already has a name. Like, we don't need to redefine nationalism as patriotism. You could just say patriotism. And nationalism has traditionally meant something a little more than just patriotism, not only as far as kind of economic policies and social policies, but also in relationship to a person's relationship to the country itself and to other citizens that I feel like they're promoting, but they're not really. It's kind of a weird thing where it's you're wanting to say something, but you're not exactly wanting to come right out and say it. And that is that obviously under nationalism, and they do kind of somewhat touch on this, but there is more of this kind of idea that you owe something to your country and it owes something to you, and you owe something to your fellow citizens. And I think that's where a lot of their policies are coming from, especially when you start talking about things like economic protectionism and how we need to have legislative morality and we need to have certain government offices to take care of manufacturing jobs or energy jobs or anything like that. It's that idea that this country owes you a specific thing because you were born in its interior. And that's really kind of scary to me, to be quite honest, as a libertarian. That kind of really freaks me out.
Yeah, I think it's deeply anti-individualistic, and ultimately, when I try to understand what is it that this program has in common, that's the only thing that I can, because ultimately, is there really something nationalistic about the sort of Sohrab against the consensus, trad Catholicism, or socially conservative? The idea that conservatives should seize the reins of power and use the government to make people behave in a moral way. Is that inherently nationalistic? Well, I don't know. I mean, I would say arguably not, but it's being lumped under nationalism when what I think it really is, and what it has to do with all of these sort of economic nationalism, is that it's an insistence that individual freedom and individual rights be subordinated to the idea of the sort of national interest and the national will. And so if you want to make a choice that would not be in the collective interest, then that you shouldn't have the right to do that. That should be subordinated. It should be overridden by the nationalist imperative that the federal government has to protect the common good or the national interest.
I think their argument would be, as far as like legislating morality, that you need to have some kind of cohesive moral structure that binds together all Americans, which, okay, whose morality are you going to use here, and how exactly do you plan on enforcing this? Because you can't legislate morality. Like, people are going to do what they're going to do. Like, if that was even a thing that was remotely possible, it would have already worked in, say, like, drug laws, and prohibition would have worked, and anything that the government's tried to prohibit people from doing would have stuck, and obviously that doesn't work. So it just strikes me as this very weird thing where it's, like I said, it's like they want to say something, but they don't want to say it out loud, or at least not yet. But all of the examples that Lowry uses in his book all have these sorts of very violent ends. Like, every time nationalism has been tried, and like the real definition of nationalism, not Lowry's weird patriotism definition, always ends in violence. And even he has to admit that, whether it's just violence within the country itself, all the way up to starting a world war or two, but it always ends violently. So you would think that would be like, dude, maybe this is not such a great idea after all.
Yeah, I thought one of the strangest things about this book was the fact that he dedicated quite a large portion of it to walking through, sort of his telling of world history and his telling of the idea of nationalism over time. He's trying to make the case that it goes way back. It's not a new concept. It's sort of an ancient idea going back hundreds of years, and it sort of naturally occurs around the world. Anytime you have a sort of coherent set of people, a sort of, a people, a nationality, they're going to develop this sort of nationalist sentiment. But almost in every single one of his historical examples, I mean, time after time after time, in his own telling, the ends are bloody. I mean, it ends in war and imperialism, and in the French Revolution and the guillotine, and in the American westward expansion, which he sort of half acknowledges involved some trampling on the rights of the Native Americans, but says like, ultimately we wouldn't want to live in a world where we hadn't done that. So it's not that big of a deal. And yeah, I just thought it was very strange that he spent so much of his book telling a history that I think any reasonable reader of that history would arrive at precisely the opposite conclusion from the one that he wanted them to arrive at,
It seems to me, and I've not read his book yet, I think I'm going to have to pick it up and read it just for the sake of saying that I did it, but it seems to me like he's falling into kind of the same trap that democratic socialists or outright socialists or communists make when they try to make the argument that, okay, if we do it this time, it won't go as far as it did the last couple of times. Like, we can do socialism without it turning into Stalinism, which obviously history proves that no, you really can't. But it's like that, it's that way of thinking that like you can stop the train before it completely goes off the track. And historically speaking, nobody has been able to do that. So it's kind of that same I don't know if I would definitely want to call it utopianism, but that same kind of like rose-colored glassism that's saying like, oh, well, we can just do just a little bit of it and it won't get crazy like it did the last couple of times. Like, it won't be Hitler. It'll be like something nicer and gentler and kinder.
Yeah, and there's a couple of ways that things can go wrong. That historically, according to the historical telling of people like Lowry, the nationalism can go wrong. And he would say, well, it goes wrong when it's tainted by malign influences. And the question is, well, is it ever not? But one way it goes wrong is through bloodshed, through war and imperialism and that sort of thing. Another way is through a sort of obsession that can develop within the homeland of cultural or ethnic or religious purity. We must maintain our purity by keeping out outsiders or by forcing them to assimilate to our way of life. And I think that is the one that is actually more relevant to the nationalist movement that we're seeing today. Now, of course, most people who are self-describing as American nationalists would deny it. But if you listen to them and listen to the way they talk about the importance of the American culture and how it's under attack and how we must secure our borders and how, it's like, it seems a little like they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. And it's maybe not full on blood and soil nationalism, but I think it's dangerous. I think it runs the risk of decaying in that way.
Absolutely. And this is another one of those where you're trying to say something without actually saying it, because when they invoke American culture, I don't understand what they mean by that. Like, what is American culture and why do you think it is under attack from immigrants? And is it so weak that the immigrants are going to come and take it over? Like, I'm baffled by the concept, because the things that I would consider American culture would be things like multiculturalism, multi-ethnicities, multi-religion, kind of the more individualistic Enlightenment sort of values that the country was founded on, but they seem to be inherently against those ideas. So I'm not understanding when they say they want to preserve the culture. I'm like, what culture are you wanting to preserve? Like, I don't understand the concept or what this part of the project is supposed to be about.
Right. I think the things that most people would agree make America exceptional or unique, the things that make our culture what it is and make it great and make it worth being proud of, and, us feeling that sort of emotional attachment to our homeland, are liberal values. They're the fact that we are this open and tolerant and adventure seeking and, success driven. And we are a big belief. We are sort of stubbornly committed to individual freedom and to resisting government, overreaching government, sort of just tyranny. I love this quote from H.G. Wells that all Americans are, from the English point of view, liberals of one sort or another. And this idea that we are all so committed to individual liberty that even the conservatives are basically liberals from a European perspective. Hayek also famously, in his essay, Why I'm Not a Conservative, made the same point. He said, what in Europe was called liberalism was here the common tradition that the conservatives were essentially trying to conserve. We're all liberals here. And so when you start talking about what is that culture and what do we need to protect it from, it's like, honestly, at this point, I feel like what the American culture and American exceptionalism needs protecting from are people like the nationalists who want to change the thing that has always made us great.
Yeah, it's like you're not trying to preserve what most people would consider to be American culture. You're trying to reshape it into this image that you have of, I'm not even quite sure where they get this, but it kind of like, I look at it the same way I look at the whole slogan, Make America Great Again. I'm like, okay, so you're saying it's not great now. So you want to take it back to some defined point in time in the past, but can you please tell me what point in time in the past that you want to take it to so we can try to explain to you how things weren't all that great back then either? But it's like this very nebulous concept that everybody within the movement seems to just be like, yeah, that, but anybody outside is like, well, what are you talking about? Like, what is it that you want? But to kind of bring it back to the piece a bit, a thing that Lowry also seems to do in the book is that he seems to just kind of gloss over our nationalist in chief, who does self-identify as a nationalist, Donald Trump, and by kind of hand waving him away by saying, well, it's not that either. It's not being an ass on Twitter and doing all this other stuff. It's not that. But I mean, you can't ignore the fact that Trump identifies himself as a nationalist. And so you would have to assume that, I mean, you can't ignore him, I wouldn't think.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in fairness, I don't think that Donald Trump is a principled nationalist, because I don't think he's a principled anything. Like I think his sort of his driving motivation is not actually America first, it's Donald Trump first. But he has chosen this word. He's chosen to embrace it. I mean, he sort of made a splash in just before the 2018 midterms by going to a rally and saying, they say nationalist is a dirty word, but you know what? I'm a nationalist. We should all be nationalists. Use that word. And so the idea that we shouldn't, it's somehow out of bounds to look at what he means by that, and what has he done? What is his record? In what ways does he seem to think that word captures what he's all about? I don't see how it could be out of bounds for us to look at that as we're trying to answer the question of what is this nationalism that is being proposed, especially because it is such a difficult word to define, and there's so much disagreement among even this conservative nationalists, the people who are Americans on the sort of American right who call themselves nationalists. They don't even all agree about the definition of that word. So as we're trying to get a sense of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, or how dangerous is it, we have to look at what are they actually calling for, what policies, and sort of, you know, what are they in favor of, and what is this powerful guy who has chosen to embrace the word and seems to have a sort of built, at the very least, whether he has a following for the nationalism, he has sort of the toleration or the support of the American right behind the things he's doing. So what is he doing? What does the word mean in practice? What does it mean in theory? What are they calling for? And what does it mean in practice? What is happening right now with this self-proclaimed nationalist in the White House? And I think the answer is some pretty nasty things. I mean, he's famously gotten a lot of heat, and I think rightly so, for saying that a judge of Mexican heritage shouldn't get to rule in one of his cases because he would be biased, or telling these Democratic congresswomen who are not white that they should go back to where they're from. You can see when I talk about how the word nationalism, I worry that it can decay into a sense of an obsession with purity, like whether cultural or ethnic or religious, an obsession with purity and, not allowing our homogeneity of our culture to be, to be sort of diluted in some way. He's not doing much to make me feel good about the likelihood that can be prevented.
I think maybe people like Trump and maybe some other conservatives are adopting Lowry's definition of the term nationalism, which is not correct. I mean, it's fine to say you're patriotic, and there is a huge difference between being patriotic and being a nationalist. But there is that strain that you brought up of very kind of racist undertones, to be completely frank, in nationalism. And it's not just here. I mean, you can also see it in India. You can see it kind of more in Turkey and some of the more European countries that have gone far right, and they do start having this internal obsession with purity and do you really belong here? Like, how far back can you trace your ancestors? I mean, they're actually doing that in India. And this idea of us versus them, and insiders versus outsiders, and othering people. And it always seems to end that way with nationalism. And I can see that kind of coming through in Lowry's strain of nationalism too, where you have this idea of like taking away birthright citizenship, or making people somehow prove that you're a real American, which I don't even know how you would begin to do that, but somehow there's some kind of American purity test to prove that your ancestors were here for this long, or you're this patriotic, or you've done this thing or that thing. And it's like, you guys realize that's really creepy and gross, right? Like that's blood and soil nationalism straight up. Like, you can't really deny that.
Right. I mean, I think that Lowry would deny that he fits into that category. And it's actually hard to know exactly I try not to, in my piece, accuse him of being that sort of nationalist, but he is very almost studious about refusing to admit that there's any particular policy agenda that fits under that would fall under or be required by his conception of nationalism. He says basically nationalism can be whatever you want when it comes to policy, as long as you love your country. And then he does actually back down later in the book and say, well, okay, but we need obviously to close our borders. But so I don't want to ascribe the worst, most noxious blood and soil views to him. I think that I can't do that because he hasn't told us what he's really in favor of, and I'm sure that he would deny it. And I just don't want to be somebody who makes an assumption like that. But I do think that the nationalist sort of moment that we're in, it can veer into that territory. Even people who are sort of the more respectable and more well-intentioned quote nationalists, they sometimes seem like they're starting to lean or veer in that direction.
Yeah, and I noticed it especially with like the birthright citizenship argument, and I've asked this several times and I've never gotten a decent answer, which is that if you get rid of birthright citizenship, then what do you replace it with? Like the whole reason we did birthright citizenship, because that's pretty much the easiest way to determine if you're an American. Like if you're born in America, you're an American, congratulations. And just irrespective of where your parents came from or your grandparents or anything like that. And that always seemed to me just the easiest way to handle it. But you are starting to see this kind of movement of people wanting to get away from that because of immigration, which is really like the one thing that it seems to me the nationalist movement has really super concrete policy ideas on that I obviously vastly disagree with. But it's this very kind of, again, this idea that, well, we have borders and we're a sovereign nation and we get to control who comes in and out. It's like, okay, yeah, cool. But what you're wanting to do is close the borders, and that's kind of not cool either. So it's like, it almost seems like anti-immigration is the core of the movement and everything else kind of circulates around that. And I try my absolute best to engage people in good faith on the topic of immigration, because on the off chance that the person I'm talking to might have anti-immigration views that are not based in some of the more vile and ugly instincts, shall we say, but a lot of what's coming out of this just seems very just not those people. Like us people, we're fine, but those people, they can't come here. And it's like, well, why not? And then it goes back to that whole argument about the culture, and it's like, okay, well, what does that mean? And then it ends up in this circular argument. So yeah, it seems to me at the core just an anti-immigration movement.
I think that's a big part of it. I also think economic protectionism and again, a major theme at the National Conservatism Conference last summer was how we need to have an industrial policy, by which they meant massive, taxpayer expenditures at the federal level to prop up and support American industry, so that our businesses and our producers and manufacturers can outcompete foreign companies, and like investment and in infrastructure and in R&D, and just like we just need to spend a lot of money, because otherwise we might lose. We might lose. Our competitors might beat us. Foreign competitors might beat us. So I think that is another big part of this. That at least because I think also it's easier for them to talk about that without being accused of being racist. Whereas when they start talking about immigration restrictionism, even though they are clearly and openly in favor of restrictionism, then they know that they are sort of becoming vulnerable to that critique. So I think the industrial policy and immigration go together, or sort of a movement away from free markets and free trade, and also a doubling down on a sort of skepticism of foreigners. Now, I don't want to deny the fact that there is something that they are reacting to, which is to say that there has been a movement on the left, the political left, in recent years and recent decades to do some pretty ugly things and pretty collectivist things and illiberal things, and use the government power in pretty inappropriate ways. and to also sort of arguably undermine our sort of cultural cohesion. So, for example, the idea of identity politics sort of dividing, it's very divisive, right? It divides us into identity subgroups and breaks down our sense of like common purpose as Americans. They're not imagining that, the nationalists, when they say we feel like the sort of American culture is under attack. I don't think they're necessarily wrong. I question their sort of prescribed response to it. The things they want to do that they think are going to fix it. And B, I also don't really see much evidence that like immigrants are the problem. If anything, it seems to be sort of bougie, upper middle class, like highly educated white people who are the driving force behind many of these things that you see like on college campuses, for example.
And that is a good point, that there is kind of that cognitive dissonance between what it is that you're wanting to fight. And like you said, a lot of this kind of stuff from the left is coming from the upper class out of academia, but your problem is with immigrants. And so it's like, well, these people, depending on what you view the problem is which group of these people are your problem. And so that's another reason it's like this weird, like I said, I'm not understanding what it is these people want. But to kind of cycle back to the points about the economy and economic protectionism, I wonder what would happen if you pointed out to these people that what they are proposing is central planning, and whether they would try to figure out a way to define themselves out of that. Because if that's what you're wanting, if you're wanting the government to take taxpayer money and funnel it into industries and to basically support certain industries, then yes, you're engaging in central planning. And I wonder if they've ever really grappled with that, because I'm sure they also think that socialism is the devil. Well, some of them probably think that, although I would imagine some of them probably don't. Actually, they probably look at some of the tenets of communism or of socialism and are like, you know what? That actually sounded like a good idea. Maybe we should pursue that.
Yeah, that's the most, I think, really astounding and surprising part of this development is the ways in which like the far left and the far right have gone so completely crazy that they're starting to sort of circle around and come back together again. And so the like obvious example, the most vivid example of this is going to be Tucker Carlson, like basically endorsing Elizabeth Warren's economic policies, right, on the air. But I think there are lots of examples of this. Now, neither side, I think, is going to openly admit to wanting to like nationalize all industries. I don't think anybody really likes the term central planning. But yeah, I mean, what they're doing is certainly moving in that direction. And some of them are pretty explicit that, so at the conference last summer, you had Yoram Hazani, who was one of the organizers, who got up on stage to sort of welcome everybody. And he said, today we declare our independence from classical liberalism. He's not hiding it, you know. They're not. Some of them are not afraid to admit that they have essentially rejected. They believe we tried classical liberalism, we tried liberal values, we tried Enlightenment values, that sort of thing. We tried a sort of libertarian economic outlook that supports free markets and free trade, and we think it failed, and so we're going to try something else now.
Yeah, and there was a brief moment in time there where they were calling themselves post-liberals, although I think they've moved on to national conservative now, or whatever they want to call themselves this week. The name's changed so many times since this whole movement started. But yeah, even now that I think about it, even under the idea of like legislating morality, you would be having the government legislate culture, which was also a big part of communism, with like the government saying like, okay, this is the culture, and now you have to go to this parade, or you have to stand up for this song, and then you have to do this and that. And it seems like they would be okay with that too. Like if they could pass a law making everybody have to stand for the national anthem, they would probably do it, which is a little frightening and is definitely against the First Amendment. But they don't seem to very much care about the Constitution, which is a little frightening, because a lot of the things that they're proposing, it's just like, you're going to run up on constitutional issues. And do you not see that and understand that? And what would be your way around that? Like I said, to me, there's not a lot of substantial policy positions coming out of this movement outside of immigration. And so that's another thing that kind of squicks me out, because it's like, okay, you have this list of problems that you have identified as problems, but I'm not seeing you point blank advocate for the solutions that you want. And that's making me wonder, do you not have them, or do you just not want to say them out loud?
Yeah, I definitely think that's true with some of the more quote liberal national conservatives. So like Rich Lowry and some others that I quote in my piece, they're definitely trying to walk a fine line where they say, well, we're nationalists, but we're not the bad kind of nationalists, and we're not illiberal, we're post-liberal even. Whereas some others are pretty openly saying, liberalism failed, we should try something else. And at least the second group has sort of the courage of its convictions. I mean, I think they're very wrong, dangerously wrong. But the first group, I think, is a little bit delusional to think that you can somehow have it both ways. Ultimately, I'm more worried, I guess, about the ones who are openly rejecting these principles and norms, because I think we are, oh my gosh, we are, if we're nothing if we're not a sort of country under the rule of law, a country that believes that like the government exists to work for us, the people, and not the other way around. If we're not a country where like the leader, the president, is under, that he's not above the law, he's under the law, it applies to him too. If we're not a country that sort of generally has a high degree of respect for individual rights and personal liberty, then I just don't know what we are. I don't know what we are anymore at that point.
Yeah, that's actually a good segue to another thing that Lowry seems to bring up, and that comes up in the national conservatism movement, and that is the role of government and what they think it should be doing. Obviously, they think it should be much larger than either you or I would ever be comfortable with. But they seem to think that the government should be promoting the quote-unquote national interest, which, again, what is the national interest? Like, can somebody please define this for me? Because I'm not quite understanding what do you want here? Like, what is that?
Yeah, that is a problem, especially because it runs into issues of democracy also. Like, if a majority of Americans say, hey, we consider ourselves to be an open and tolerant and pluralist and diverse society, and we like, having new people come here from other parts of the world and having our culture sort of, be influenced by, but also assimilate them into what it was to begin with. And so we're in favor of more immigration, and we're in favor of taking in refugees. And we are, we also are all about trade and openness, and think it's great that global free trade, for example, is lifting millions upon millions of people out of abject poverty in the third world. And so let's keep it up. The nationalists have to say, nope, you're wrong. The national interest, there's a sort of nationalist imperative that says, if there's any harm done to Americans by any of these things, as we define it, of course, and as we have decided to measure it, then we can overrule your wishes, the sort of democratic wishes of the people, and sort of insist on different policies. I think that's a big part of this too.
Yeah, and I don't think that's going to go over so well. And I think that's why you're not seeing a lot of concrete policy proposals coming out of this movement, is because they know the minute that you start really getting down to nuts and bolts, like, okay, what are we going to do? What's the plan? Who's going to enforce this? How's this going to work? People are going to be like, have you lost your damn mind? Like, that's not remotely possible in this country for various and assorted reasons. And so it's just like, I don't know what to make of this movement. It's gaining popularity, but it's like, I kind of draw a lot of parallels to kind of what's going on with the democratic socialist movement, where you can get support by saying nice things and it sounds nice in people's ears, but once you start getting down to policy, all of a sudden people are like, okay, no, not that. Like, that's crazy. I don't want to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Especially when you start talking about the costs associated with those policies.
Yeah, and then obviously under whatever it is that nationalists want, there is going to be a cost, because obviously you're going to have more government to make it happen. You're going to have government to enforce it to happen. And especially if you're talking about things in more of a cultural realm, you're walking into some very, very bad areas where how exactly are you going to enforce morality, or how are you going to enforce cultural cohesion? That's when you start getting into totalitarianism, and that's, yeah, no.
Yeah, I think that the sort of inability of Sohrab Ahmari, who was, of course, one of the signatories of the Against the Dead consensus letter, and then wrote a follow-up piece for First Things, in which he attacked National Review writer David French, and he said that we need to sort of seize control of government and use it to reorient society toward the common good and toward the highest good. When he was asked, well, okay, what does that mean in practice? He shied away from answering, and he specifically raised the example of Drag Queen Story Hour. I don't know if you talked about this on your podcast. This is like a small movement that sometimes these events are held at public libraries where a drag queen will read a children's book to a group of kids who are brought there by their parents voluntarily. Of course, that's an important part of this. And when Ahmari was asked, well, okay, you're very upset about the existence of these events, what exactly would you do about it? He didn't have an answer, because the real thing, I think, deep down in their hearts, that they want to be able to do is say, I want to ban them from existing at all. I want to keep them out of the public square. I want to silence and censor them. But they know they can't say that. No, I mean, that's crazy, right? So instead they say, well, I don't know. I just think that Josh Hawley should hold a Senate hearing, and we should, talk about it some more. And it's political theater, it's intimidation, but it's sort of soft tyranny instead of hard tyranny, because they know that they sort of can't defend the hard tyranny that I think a lot of them really wish they could do.
Yeah, the whole David Frenchism episode was quite amusing, just because David French is such a nice guy, and he was just so confused by how he ended up dragged into this.
Yep.
He's like, wait, what? What is... I'm a movement now? But yeah, the whole Drag Queen Story Hour thing was just ridiculous, but it does help to illustrate that, like, okay, well, you have these grievances, but how exactly under your system would this be addressed? And there's no other way other than totalitarianism. But like you said, you can't say that, because that's when everybody is going to, like, leave the room, metaphorically speaking, and be like, now these people are nuts.
Yeah. No, on economic policy, I think they're actually more willing to speak openly. Whereas just a few years ago, the Republican Party was squarely in the camp that supported free trade. Now Republicans have sort of lined up, whether reluctantly or not, they've lined up behind the Trump trade war, the tariffs, the idea that it's a sort of, I describe it in the piece as a mercantilist outlook, the idea that the government should be trying to protect American, again, manufacturers and businesses. And so they're pretty openly supporting, all this sort of industrial policy and protectionism that we were talking about earlier, without, I think, grappling with the fact that in reality, there are costs to Americans from those policies as well. I mean, one obvious one is the cost of goods and services to consumers is going up. But last night at Reason, at our DC office, we actually had an event in which we heard from some small business owners. We heard from the CEO of Flying Dog Brewery, which is an American, beer manufacturer here in, they're actually in Maryland, so not too far from DC. And he was talking about how the steel and aluminum tariffs has disproportionately hurt craft brewers. They need steel and aluminum for their cans, for their equipment, for their kegs, right? So they're being hurt by the aluminum and steel tariffs. And we also heard from a young woman who owns a wine and cheese shop, and she was talking about how retaliatory tariffs from the EU and from other countries and other parts of the world on wine and cheese are really hurting her bottom line. These are the people that are ostensibly protected by these, quote, protectionist economic policies, and they're actually harming Americans.
Yeah, and especially I've seen especially the stuff coming out of France, like the wine and cheese, the tariffs on that are nuts now. But it's like you try to explain to people, especially on the topic of tariffs, it's like, okay, if you just tariff this one thing, like, okay, shit rolls downhill. Like, if you put a tariff on aluminum, well, now things made out of aluminum are going to cost more money. And it just affects the supply chain all the way down to where once you get to buying the thing at the store, it's going to be more expensive and you are going to be the one to pay for those tariffs. Like, China's not eating the tariffs. Manufacturers are not eating the tariffs because businesses don't eat taxes. They pass them along to consumers. Everybody, I thought, knew that, but apparently we have to have that basic economic lesson again.
Well, and if they are absorbing if they are sort of eating those costs, those cost increases, it's not like you could just absorb them and they have no effect. Then you have less money left over for innovation and expansion of your business. So there's always second order consequences, and they always are those that affect the economy and consumers and workers and all the other interrelated aspects of the economy in various ways. There's no free lunch.
Yeah, and to me, the economic protectionists have this very simplistic view of economics that doesn't take reality into effect, and how the butterfly effect is real when it comes to supply chains and stuff like that. And when you do this one little thing, it's going to impact somebody else massively. And like, okay, say Flying Dog has to pay more for their cans. Okay, well now maybe that's money that's not going to be spent on hiring new employees. So now
exactly
you're keeping somebody out of a job, or somebody's not getting a raise, or maybe we're not increasing production. Like, it affects everybody downstream in a way that I've not seen any of them actually really grapple with.
Right, exactly.
But kind of moving on from that, and kind of a way to wrap this up, since to kind of bring it back to us, they definitely have some views on libertarians. They don't like us too much. In fact, apparently we are just the root of all evil because we've ruined all the things when we were in power, which when was that exactly?
I know, blinked and we missed it. I don't know.
Was it at like between 2 and 4 a.m. on a Tuesday night when we were all asleep? I was just like, wait a minute, when did we ruin everything? We never ran anything. I thought that was the whole point, is you guys made fun of us because we never run anything. But yeah, we've kind of become the punching bag, and that's the part that kind of amuses me, but probably should amuse me a lot less, because it means there's a lot of people who don't really understand what libertarianism is. But it seems like, once again, it's our turn to be the punching bag for the conservative movement and how libertarians have ruined all the things.
Yeah.
And it's apparently our fault for Drag Queen Story Hour and all of the economic policies and porn too. Apparently we did that too, I guess. Which yep. Which that seems to be kind of like their biggest cultural front right now, is the war on porn. And I'm just like, are we doing this again? Didn't we do this like twice already? Like, can we please stop?
Nothing new in history. Ugh.
Apparently not, but it's just so weird. Like, I don't know. I cannot pin down what exactly these people want, because I think ultimately they are being deliberately dodgy about some of it, because like I said, some of this stuff you can't really say out loud. It's just kind of one of those wink, wink, nudge, nudge things. And so, yeah, I really don't know what to make of them as a movement. But the one thing that does kind of make me very sad and very frightened is if the right starts to go in this sort of nationalist way, then it's just going to be libertarians left out here advocating for free trade and open markets and individualism and freedom of expression, because obviously that's fallen away on the left too, especially when you had people like Elizabeth Warren, who has dropped out, but Bernie Sanders, who is still very much in the race, who kind of espouse these same principles, maybe not on the cultural perspective, but on the economic perspective, that we do need economic protectionism and we need tariffs and we need to figure out a way to bring the jobs back from China and all of this other stuff. And I feel like we're about to be in a very lonely place, and that scares me.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. My one sort of, my one like ray of hope is that I'm wondering if, as both the far left and the far right just lose their damn minds and continue to move so far out into the extremes that, again, I start to feel like they at some point become almost indistinguishable from each other. Do we start looking like the sane moderates, which is like a new thing for us, where we've always been the radicals and the fringe libertarians, the crazy folks. But compared to what's happening on both left and right now, I mean, maybe we start to look pretty good as an alternative.
I've made that argument before to somewhat interesting response, but yeah, it's kind of becoming the point where if you look at the political spectrum, and even if you want to look at it as like political horseshoe, which I thoroughly believe in, and I'm starting to believe more that it might be just a damn circle at this point, but we would be, in comparison to where the right is and where the left is, we would kind of be at the top of the horseshoe now, which is weird. Like, we're usually the fringe people, and it's like, when did we become the not crazies?
Yeah. I mean, when the people who look sanest in your political system are the ones who think we should like legalize heroin and put it in vending machines, you really got to ask yourself, what has happened to both the left and the right?
Like, oh my God. Yeah. If both of those just fell off the cliff, if the current iterations of the right and the left fell off a cliff and it just left the libertarians and the neoliberals, I would be okay with that.
Same.
But yeah, it's just, I don't know what to make of this current moment other than I'm not going to like it. No matter who wins this year, I'm not going to like it. I've already resigned myself to that. It's not going to get any better or easier for libertarians, at least not in the short run. Maybe, hopefully, in the long term, if both sides go crazy enough, people might start being like, hey, the libertarians, let's give them a shot.
Well, I am hopeful that, again, another thing that makes me hopeful, not necessarily optimistic, but at least a little bit hopeful, is that I do think the left, the sort of socialist moment on the left, they've gotten out in front of their skis a little bit. I think your average Democratic voter is not a socialist. They don't like that word. They're pretty nervous about the idea of the party going all the way out in that direction. So I kind of think that like, yeah, I mean, Bernie's had some surprising success. That's true. But I think there's probably going to be a correction as the party comes back to where the center of gravity of the Democratic Party is. And I'm hopeful that post-Trump, something similar will happen on the right, where people sort of wake up from this fever dream and remember that there was a reason we supported like free trade, for example. There's we learned these lessons, and this was a sort of momentary flirtation with insanity, but it's time to come back to the principles that we know are right.
I sincerely hope so, because there's a lot of people right now who are feeling very, very alienated from both parties because of kind of the current insanity going on. And I hope that maybe at some point somebody regains some level of sanity, but if not, at least we'll be here to try to hoover up those people, and then maybe we can make some more libertarians. Hopefully, maybe.
I hope so. That would be nice.
All right. Well, at this point, I think we've gone on long enough, so we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. So go ahead and plug anything that you want to plug. Obviously, people already know where to find you, but go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I hope that people will definitely follow and engage with me on Twitter at SladeSR. Check out the new issue of Reason, the April 2020 issue of Reason, with my cover story against the new nationalism. I'm around. I'm excited to hear what people think. If you think that I'm totally crazy and I'm getting it wrong, and there is a way to make nationalism be compatible with classical liberalism, like, I would definitely love to hear it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me, Stephanie.
Thank you for having me.
So that was my conversation with Stephanie about her Reason piece that will be the cover piece for the April 2020 issue. I will put a link down in the show notes to the piece if you want to read it yourself, or if you do already have a digital subscription or would like to pick up a copy. And as always, if you did make it this far, thank you for listening. And if you do like this, please rate, comment, and subscribe. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, and on my Patreon page. Take care, and until next time.